Okay, so my research is not as exciting as regrowing body parts, but my research for the past year has been focused on some rather obscure, some obscure Middle English poetry by a French duke. The project was to translate the text of that is found in one manuscript, British Library Harley MS 682. That's just the shelf mark. It tells you where it's in the library. I'll call it the manuscript or Harley 682. The manuscript itself was found, it is from the 1430s and is written in Middle English. It is poetry, and it is the earliest book. It is the first book of. It is the longest book of English lyric poetry by a single author before print, and also it is the longest. It's also the longest, 6,000 lines, and it's the earliest before print. And nobody has ever made an English translation, modern English translation of these poems. It's still in Middle English. The few editions that have been made only have notes. And my goal was to make the first modern English translation. Unfortunately, I did not have access to the manuscript myself. It is in the British Library, and they do not have it digitized. And you have to go to the reading room in London to see it. And one of my professors did, and he was not allowed to take pictures. So I had to rely on an edition by Dr. Mary Jo Arnn that was published in 1994, Fortune and Stableness, which is a very good edition. It just does not have a translation. So some quick historical background: Charles d'Orléans was born in 1394 in France. He was the son of the Duke of Orleans, Louis, and his wife Valentina Visconti. And Louis was the brother of King Charles VI of France. So Charles was the nephew of the king. He was, that made him a prince of the blood, which meant that he was a legitimate heir to the possible legitimate heir to the throne. This was during the 100 Years' War when England was trying to take the throne of France, and Charles had a very rough life. When he was 13, his father was brutally murdered on the orders of his political enemy, the Duke of Burgundy. The next year, his mother died, and then the year later, Charles's own wife. He was married rather young to his his older cousin, Isabel de Valois. She died in childbirth. Their daughter did survive. And things got worse for him. In 1415, he was captured at the Battle of Agincourt against England. If you're familiar with that, you're probably from Shakespeare's Henry V, where Charles actually does appear briefly as the Duke of Orleans. And I love that one of his main parts is criticizing the French prince's bad poetry. So the prince says that he wrote a poem about his horse, and he starts, and Charles says, "I have heard one address a poem begun thus to one's mistress," and it goes downhill from there. He was taken prisoner, and he was found under a pile of bodies, and was taken prisoner by the king, and he was held in England for 25 years without ransom. He was by the time of the Treaty of Troyes in 1420, Charles was the only when the French prince was disinherited and Henry was made the heir to the French throne when Charles VI was to die. Charles d'Orléans was the only thing standing in the way, so he was kept out of circulation. And in his copious amounts of free time in England, he learned English, and he wrote in both English and French. And his French poetry is rather well remembered in French literature. His poem on spring is quite often anthologized, but his English poetry has not been as well remembered. And he was finally released in 1440. He was 46 almost 46 at the time. And he returned to France, where he had actually ended up missing much of the 100 Years' War, including the liberation of his own city, of the city that bears his name, which was Orléans, which was under siege by the English. It was liberated by a young girl named Joan of Arc. So he returned to France, the war ended, and he settled down, finally was able to settle down and have a family, and continued writing in French. And he left when he left England, he left the English manuscript there. And as I said, it's over 6,000 lines, and that was my project, was to translate it. You may be, I didn't have anything up here about it, but you may be familiar a little with Middle English. It's the form of English that was used from the late 12th century to the late 15th century. If you're familiar with it, you may know probably Geoffrey, Chaucer and the Canterbury Tales. And if you do, you probably know that it sounds a lot different from modern English. The book, so I had to deal with some differences between English and English now, and you'll see those a little later. And my goals, and you'll see how those play out. My goals were to follow the original language as much as possible. If there was a modern English version of a word, if I could just modernize it, I would use that. And if I couldn't, I would have to deal. Wait, what did he hit? Okay, sorry, I hit some button. And I wanted to use Charles's original language because he liked language and having fun with it, and he knew what he wanted to say. So I don't like it when translators change words and put in things that weren't there. And the poetry rhymes, and it is in pentameter, usually it is in pentameter. So 10 syllables to a line, accent on each other syllable, iambic pentameter, which is fairly common in English poetry. And so I wanted to keep the original rhyme and the original meter, and I wanted to but also at the same time, I wanted to make it make it comprehensible for anyone, even if they didn't know anything about Middle English, that they could read it and enjoy it. I haven't tried to stay as faithful as I can, but it's a little hard because Charles' English is weird. He was not a native English speaker. He would have learned it via immersion during his time in England, although French was still a common language with the nobility and in literature. But he was fluent, but he was not always correct in his writing, and there are some strange reasons for that. He sometimes spelled words in weird ways, which, like, an example I have here is falcon for fashion. In Ballad 2, it's usually would be in similar spellings to his would be spelled F-A-U-C-I-O-U-N, and it means fashion and face, for face. But he spelled it with a K. In this manuscript, it's spelled with a K. We don't know if it's the scribe that misspelled something, but Middle English has no standardized spelling. But Charles managed to misspell words in a language with no standardized spelling. So I'm very impressed with that. And that is one thing scholars note often, is that there are spellings that only appear in his manuscript, which makes it very hard to look words up in the Middle English dictionary. There were one website I used, Manuscripts Online. You can type in a word and see where it appears in manuscripts from around, I think, starting in the year 1000 through into the 1500s, and find manuscripts where that word appears. And often I would type in a word and find it's only in Harley 682. Like, thanks. And he would change a word's ending to make it rhyme with something. And if he had to, he was not very strict with himself on the rhyming. Almighty became All Might in one poem, to rhyme with light in Ballad 36. Another was always. He would sometimes end as alway. He would take off the S if he had to rhyme it with another word that ended with the A sound. As I said, he liked to have fun with it. He didn't limit himself. And syntax is often very strange, which is probably because he was also thinking in French. And French is a much more flexible language than English is in syntax, and so often that appears. He would often do things strangely with the syntax to get things to get a particular effect with the verses. So it wasn't always that he was making a mistake necessarily. He was doing it for a particular reason. And there are cases where he would know that there was a word. He might know that there was a word for something, but he didn't know what the word was. So he would make something up that fit with it, that worked with it. I think there's something that I don't think it's sufficiency. There's something similar to that sovereignty. That he made the word sovereign and sovereign into sovereignty, which is a word that doesn't exist. So good on you, Charles. To deal with these idiosyncrasies, caused that there were a lot of points where I was not able to properly translate things. What I could not translate well, especially at the end of lines for rhyming, are gloss to the side of the text, and you'll see what I mean there, and things requiring longer notes. Like if I needed to explain something about how the verse is constructed or historical background, was in footnotes. And here we do have an example. This is Ballad 6. Not long ago I hied me apace, in secret wise min hert for to conceal, himself for to withdraw as for a space, out of love's painful thought and travail. To which he said to me, Nay, set thee there a nail. Speak to me no more thereof, I heartily pray, for God wot, to love shall me pain. For I have chose the fairest that may be, as me reported hath mine eyen twain. And then I have the modern English translation. Not long ago I hastened myself apace, in secret my heart to counsel, himself to withdraw for as a space, out of love's painful thought and travail. To which he said, No, set there a nail. Speak no more of this to me, I pray. For God knows to love I shall me pain, for I have chosen the fairest that may be, as my eyes have reported to me twain. So I have placed to the side, for set there a nail, it means I stop at that. And I shall me pain, I shall... What am I hitting? Okay. Oh, turn off the screen. Okay. That's literally what it does. And I shall me pain, I shall take pains. And the final line, the refrain, which is the refrain of the ballad, it occurs at the end of each stanza. As my eyes have, as me reported, hath mine eyen twain. As my two eyes have reported to me. I've put a footnote there. And I have a longer example here. I will not read that out loud if you do not want me to, but when fresh Phoebus, day of Saint Valentine, had whirled up his golden chair aloft, the burned bemis of it gone to shine, in at my chamber where I slept soft, of which the late had that with him brought, he woke me of the sleep of heaviness, wherein forslept he all that night, doubtless, upon my bed so hard of noyous thought. And this particular poem is really interesting. He tells about how in the morning he is woken up by the birds outside, and to these birds and said, You birds ought to thank nature, where it fits me not, that you have your mates to your gladness, where I sorrow the death of my mistress, upon my bed so hard of painful thought. It was a popular folk tradition in England, and I think some parts of the continent, that birds chose their mates on Valentine's Day. And it famously appears in another piece of Middle English poetry, Parliament of Fowls, by Geoffrey Chaucer, which was written for the having to do with the engagement of King Richard II and Anne of Bohemia. This poem, you'll notice the reference is Valentine's Day. You just read the first ever Valentine's Day poem. That is the earliest of Charles's Valentine's Day poems, and it was the only one that was written in England. And there's another poem that's usually referenced as the first Valentine's poem, but that I believed it actually dates from when he was back in France. But he is credited with writing the first Valentine's Day poem. So, oh, that's it. Okay, so the project is still ongoing. and I've got about a third of it done. I do intend to finish the whole book. This picture right here, I should explain, is found in another manuscript of Charles's poetry that is at the British Library, and you actually can see this one online, and which is great because it's absolutely beautiful. It is a book of his French poetry, and this is a picture of him in the Tower of London, which is where he was brought to first. That's him in the window up there, and him at the desk, and that's British Library manuscript Royal 16F, and it was at one point owned by Edward IV, by King Edward IV, and it was later owned by Henry VII, and it also owned by Henry's son Arthur. It contains his French poetry. Also contains a series of called the Pseudo Heloise, which is based off of the scholar Heloise of Heloise and Abelard. The reason I also mentioned the French poetry is that there's a manuscript in France, in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, that is considered is his personal manuscript, which was just his notebook, and his is the second most common hand found in it. Often people would write things and then they would give it to a scribe to copy into a manuscript, and so his is the second most common. Second most common hand found. There's another scribe, but it's more common, but that actually follows the same pattern that in part follows the English book. I did not mention at the beginning because I was more interested in talking actually about the process of translating that. The story follows a very loose story of a young man who's called Charles, Duke of Orleans. It isn't necessarily Charles, just like Chaucer the Pilgrim is not Chaucer the poet, or Dante is not the same as his own character. He enters the service of the god of love, and through a series of ballads, he meets a lady and he praises his lady, talks about how wonderful she is, and then about 56 poems in, the lady comes sick and dies. And the rest of that ballad series is mourning the lady, including the one that we just read, that he has lost his mate. That is what it refers to. And he then leaves, renounces the service of love, and retires to the castle of no care, giving up. And then he meets with the goddess of love, Venus, who introduces him to a new lady who's very similar to the other one, but they have a much different much more complicated relationship than he did with the first lady. It kind of does mirror Charles's life. Charles's second wife, Bondarmac, died while he was in England, in the mid 1430s. The lady is not necessarily Bon or anyone he knew. The book is based off of other poetry, of other courtly romance poetry, but there are some things that probably came a bit from his own experiences psychologically. I think if there's anything else. I think that's about it for explaining it. Otherwise, I will go on for the rest of the day. I hope you know a little more about what goes into translating this poetry. And I do intend to finish the whole book. And I want to thank Dr. Heil for supporting me all through this time. Thank you. And I'm sorry for my finger keep hitting the button to turn off the screen. So.
Thank you, Fyodor. This was excellent and very interesting presentation.
Thank you.
We're opening the floor for questions. If you guys have any questions.
I'll let you look. Okay, thank you, Fio. What prompted you to become interested in this work?
As I said, Charles appears in Henry V, And one day my friends and I were talking about the play, and we started wondering about the backstories of some of the minor characters that are actually historical. We were wondering about the about the French figures. And so I looked him up, and I found, oh, hey, he was a poet. And then one of my friends found one of his Middle English poems, actually. And so I got more interested in him. There's a novel that was written in the 1940s in Holland, and later was about 40 years later was finally published in English, In a Dark Wood Wandering by Hella Hasse, and I read that, which is an excellent description of Charles's life. And then I was looking through a database one day, and I found an edition of the poetry, and that's where this started. So.
You said you were going to try to keep the historical background to a minimum,
I
but that's always my favorite part is when you get really into it. And so I want to ask a question about historical background, because when I saw the way that he spelled fashion looking more like falcon, it made me think, well, that's the kind of error that someone would do if they learned primarily through reading instead of through speaking. And it made me curious about his imprisonment, because I know often when a noble person would be in captivity like that, they'd be treated just like another English noble and have a very potentially very good social life. So it made me wonder about how much of his imprisonment was being part of a community.
He was held in the Tower of London for about a year and a half. I don't know how much contact he had with the outside world. And then he was moved to Pontefract Castle in York, and he became friends with the warden of the castle, Richard Waterton, and his wife and his children. And then King Henry heard about that and put a stop to that and moved Charles again. Charles got moved around quite often, so in part so that he would not make any lasting bonds with anybody that might help him get out. He did spend some time with the Duke of Suffolk, who became a good friend of his. And interestingly, Suffolk's wife was a lady named Alice Chaucer, who was actually the granddaughter of the master Geoffrey Chaucer. But he did make friends, some of whom Suffolk he did keep in touch with, some after he returned to France. And he was able to read books, and he actually purchased some of the books from when the Duke of Bedford died. He purchased some of the Duke of Bedford's books while he was in England. So he did have contact with people and literature. He was kept in good condition. And I'm trying to think if there was anyone else of note that he would have met. He did meet King Henry, and I believe he would have had contact with the Duke of Gloucester, who hated him. But he was not. I didn't talk about the whole political background of why Charles's poetry never got on in England. He was French, and they hated the French, and one person in particular hated him, and so on. But I'm trying to think of anything else. He did have a lot of books. While he was there, and one thing I forgot to mention is his little brother had been sent to England as a hostage during the 100 Years' War, and during a failed bargain between Charles's side in another conflict in England. And Jean was actually held there even longer than Charles was. Jean was 12 when he was sent there. And so Jean would have spent part of his time growing up in England, and he finally did see Jean again, and they both had some very interesting books that shows a bit of their involvement in the literary community, I guess. That Jean had a copy of the Canterbury Tales written in a northern dialect, and so I don't know what Charles would have picked up from what books. So I hope that was way too long an answer. Those. Yeah.
I enjoyed your presentation. Thank you. I'm curious about the translation process and some of the idiosyncrasies of the English as you describe them. So it seems like there are mistakes, like that weird Faucon fashion thing, which is one thing. But then it seems like the always, chopping off the S on the always, is not so much a mistake as it is a liberty, or a sort of taking liberty with the text. And so, do you treat those differently in the translation? I mean, does one need to be glossed more than the other? Do you just correct the mistakes and then try to somehow address or not the liberties that he takes with the text? Or how do you handle that
Okay,
as
if
a
it was something
translator?
that I could easily translate into a modern English word, like falcon, I translated into, I believe I put as fashion, and then I glossed it as face, because if it had been spelled properly in Middle English, I would have put it into what it looked like in the modern English, and then I would have glossed it as what it actually means. And then when it came to like alway and all might, I kept it as that because he did that for a particular reason, to make it rhyme with something else. And that was a stylistic decision to chop off the thing, and it would mess up the rhyme if I changed it. And if it didn't make sense, I would gloss it. If it didn't make sense after it was cut, I would explain what the word was supposed to be. So.
Yeah, that sounds like a good way to handle
Okay,
it.
thank you.
I have a question too.
Okay.
So I saw that like there's at least one sort of French word like travail was in it in one of the excerpts, and that just means work. So how much Old French do you actually run into, and then how do you sort of handle identifying is this English or is this French, and if it is French, what would be the appropriate way to go about handling that when translating it into modern English?
That's a little weird because at the time, as I said, French was still kind of a common language with the nobility in England, even though English did take over as the language of court around that time. It was still a common language in literature, and there are French words that were used at the time in literature that were like loan words, that like when we use a French word now in English, but they're no longer used. I think there are some cases of that. I would just gloss that, or I would translate something as close as I could. I don't run into French very often. He did do a very good job of being English, of sounding English. In fact, so much so that for years it was many people argued that he could not have possibly written it, because apparently there wasn't enough French in it for a French person to have written something English so well. So I don't really run into Middle French quite often in that. And if I do, it's something that can easily be connected to English. It's a really good question.
I have.
Oh.
Can I ask one more question?
Yes.
Oh, you want to ask?
I thought you had a question. Oh.
I do have a question, but okay. So, but I'm giving you
Okay.
the priority. So my question is, I'm sorry, I don't know enough about this topic or this kind of research, but so excuse me if it sounds ridiculous. One is, I have two questions.
Okay.
Sorry. One, how long did it take you to translate just like one piece of the poetry? And the second part is, now that you're already started the research and translating the work, right?
Mm-hmm.
Do you see a future of more of his work being translated to English and get appreciated more, or his work in English get appreciated more, I should say?
To answer the first question, it depended on how familiar I was with the words used. When I started, it took me a lot longer, obviously, since I wasn't as familiar with Middle English. I wasn't familiar at all with Middle English yet. But now, to get like a stanza done, it might take me a few minutes. After you know some Middle English words, it gets kind of quicker, obviously. So it doesn't take particularly long because you're translating just a different version of the same language. But when it comes to like grammar and comes to words that aren't used anymore, that might take more time to sort out what I want to actually say. And the second question, do I see a future? I certainly hope so. There's been a lot of interest in his English work. There's been a lot of scholarship done on it recently. And unfortunately, there just has not been a translation done. You can't go to Barnes & Noble and buy a copy of his like you can Chaucer the Gowan poet. So I hope there will be a future. My goal is to finish translating the book. I hope to someday be able to actually work with the manuscript to finish my edition and hopefully publish it someday. So I hope there will be a future. I hope that more people will be able to enjoy him, and I hope that he'll become more well known in English and enter the Middle English canon of the important authors you're supposed to read, which is where he certainly deserves to be, but sadly has not entered yet. So thank you.
I'm just curious about the ending of the brothers' time in England. You said that John was there longer than Charles, and that, of course, made me curious about when he got to leave. And can you just briefly tell us, they would not receive a ransom, they wouldn't let him go. Can you tell us what changed that made it possible for these brothers to get out of there?
Okay. Jean was taken a hostage by the Duke of Clarence in 1412, I think thereabouts. John was 12 at the time, and I didn't really explain that there was a civil conflict going on in France at the time that is connected to the war, and it's very complicated. But at the time, the war with England was kind of in a lull, and so different sides in France could make deals with England, and Charles tried to make a deal with England, and one of the terms was sending a hostage, and the hostage happened to be his brother Jean. I don't know how they decided on that, but his little brother was sent to England and held by Clarence. And when Charles obviously was trying to be able to ransom him. I don't remember what the terms of ransom were for Jean, or if they were actually were known, but. When Henry took Charles back to England, he wanted to keep Charles out of circulation because Charles was a threat to Henry's claim to the French throne, because Charles was actually a blood heir. And he ordered that there was to be no ransom set for Charles, that there was they were not going to get Charles back. And Charles was not to be released when it was clear that Henry was going to die. He apparently one of the last things he did in his arrangements was making sure that Charles would not be released until at least his son Henry, the future Henry VI, was of age. And Henry was 19 when Charles was released. Henry was 6 months old when his father died. He became king when he was a baby. So. They actually, and also interestingly enough, they were cousins, and Charles and Henry were cousins, but because Charles's cousin Catherine was Henry's mother, but they would not allow there to be a ransom, and then it was set the war was kind of winding down with England and France. It wasn't going very well. France Henry was looking to make peace with France, and one thing he did was they agreed that if Charles would be released, that this huge ransom was paid. It was absolutely huge, a literal prince's ransom, I guess you could say. It was paid actually by the Duke of Burgundy and his wife, Duke of Burgundy was the son of the Duke who had had Charles's father killed. So it's interesting how their families later were connected, but in a better way. But the ransom was paid, I think it was set at like 300,000 ducats or something. It was a huge ransom. And Charles had to agree that he would not take up arms against England. That was one of the main reasons they were afraid to release him, was they were afraid that he would go back to war against England. And then, however, they still had to pay off Jean's ransom, and Jean was stuck in England for another 4 years before Charles could finally get the money, finish paying off the ransom. So I hope that answers the question. It's kind of a complicated one because it goes back into multiple histories.
So 7 years longer.
Yeah, it's a very poor thing. Raphael Holinshed says that Charles spoke better English than he did French when he was released. I imagine Jean did too. So, yeah.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Fyodor.
Thank you. I know.